We should be live in about right now. All right, beautiful. We should be live. Just double check. All right, cool. So we are live on Facebook. I am going to tag you on Facebook. All right. Okay, so actually I'll just double check yours while I got you here. All right, perfect.
I think I just got a notification. Yeah.
All right, perfect. All right, so let me go ahead and tag you on LinkedIn. Hopefully. Yeah, LinkedIn is it's a slightly different in how the feed comes up.
I honestly didn't even know LinkedIn had that ability to do live.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, you actually got to apply to get approved to do lives. It's still kind of in a beta testing mode, I would say. So they are, and it's not super extensive in terms of, you know, applying, but they haven't rolled it out to everyone. So, all right. So if you are watching on Facebook or watching on LinkedIn, we'll get started in a second. We are just trying to get everything set up on my end. And actually, Rob, you might have to go on your LinkedIn and share it on your profile, because I'm not figuring out how to.
Should I have got a notification or anything from you? Or
No,
how do I
not yet.
do that?
No.
Okay.
You might have to go to my page because it's not letting me. It's not letting me get to the actual post where I can tag you in it.
Gotcha. So I'm on your page now.
Okay.
I see the link. I see the live at the top.
Mm-hmm. So if you scroll down to the activities, you should see it. You should see the post under activity.
Okay.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks.
go
ahead.
We're good.
What's up, Valencia? I see you. All right. So did you you shared it to your page?
Share. Yep, I'm sharing it right now.
Okay. All right. Beautiful. So once you're done with that, we're good to go.
I'm all done.
All right. Beautiful. All right. So, all right. Welcome everybody to our basically today we're having a conversation. Tonight's conversation is around community and economic development. And we're talking about the roles that cities play in the built environment. And we have a very, very, very esteemed and accomplished guest today. I'm excited about who we have on the line. This brother has been working. He's been working hard, and not just in his current capacity, but he's been putting in work for quite some time and really just been graduating through the levels. And we'll get a chance to talk about that today. But if you can, everybody give our guest Rob a virtual round of applause. Show him some love, show him some support in the comments. Let us know that you're watching. And definitely, if you have any questions for tonight, I'm going to do my best to monitor the comments. But if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat. I can see your responses both on LinkedIn and on Facebook. So with that being said, welcome, Rob. And let me read this brother's bio. All right, so we have Rob Denham, who was born and raised in Milo Grogan. I hope I said that right. Milo Grogan, the Milo Grogan neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. Rob currently serves as a senior development officer with the City of Cincinnati's Department of Community and Economic Development. He received his Bachelors of Urban Planning from the University of Cincinnati and his Masters of Sustainable Real Estate Development from Tulane University in New Orleans. Rob became interested in economic development after studying the makeup of his inner city neighborhood while growing up in Columbus, Ohio. Determined to create and sustain thriving urban environments, he has held a host of public and private positions to learn all he can about the many facets of revitalization. Rob is also a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated and holds many roles within the community development space, serving as a member of the OTR, which is short for Over the Rhine, Chamber of Commerce Business Retention and Attraction Committee. And he's also a graduate of the Urban Land Institute's Real Estate Accelerator Lab program, which is an industry-supported program designed to educate and mentor the next generation of greater Cincinnati real estate professionals. The goal of the REAL program is to expand diversity, race, ethnicity, and gender identity in real estate development by offering a selected group the opportunity to expand their knowledge and build their skills. And throughout Rob's years of growing in the field, he continues to broaden his horizons and he remains eager to learn more in the field to be and to become the best he can be. So give us that virtual round of applause for my man, Rob. Rob, welcome.
Appreciate it, brother. Appreciate the warm welcome.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So outside of the illustrious bio, is there anything that you would like the good people to know about you as we get started?
Nothing else. I think you covered it well. I'm excited to share a little bit more about myself and kind of my career path, and hopefully encourage more people to get into this field. But I do want to thank everybody for taking some time out of your evening to kind of hear me out, because I mean, people could be doing so many other things. So I appreciate you, Kevin, and then also everybody who's tuned in.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And you still there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely, man. I'm glad to be able to have a platform where we're able to, just dialogue, man, talk about some things. And one of the things you had mentioned is just getting more people involved in the field. And for me, part of the reason why I've been building the platform that I have is because the real estate industry needs a lot more exposure, especially at the higher levels of the game. And if you don't know, and I'm just talking to the audience, if you aren't familiar with the Community and Economic Development Department, if you aren't familiar with how city government or state government or federal government is involved in real estate, or if you aren't even familiar with commercial real estate, we're really talking about real estate at the highest levels of transactions, at the highest levels of business, at the highest levels of impacting and influencing people's everyday lives. So to have the opportunity to sit down with Rob and really get that high level perspective and get it from somebody who doesn't always look like the general makeup of the industry, right? Commercial real estate is just like a lot of industries. It's been very well documented that there's a lack of diversity. So by having this platform, it gives us the opportunity to highlight people who look like us, right? Who come from similar backgrounds and who are actually making waves in the industry so that we can provide that level of exposure, because a lot of times people just aren't aware of what people do for a living and then what that means or how that impacts them. So I'm excited to have you, Rob. Definitely.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. So before we went live, one of the things you had mentioned, you said, man, today was a busy day. The day kind of got away from you a little bit, but because we're at the end of the year, there's some things going on with city council. So I thought that would actually be a great place to start. If you could just kind of give us some insight into what's going on in the council, why or how you're involved with what's going on in the council and how that impacts, what you do for a living.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll give a little bit of context of kind of what I do. And I think that would also answer your question. So as a senior development officer in the economic development department of the city, my main responsibilities is to develop, administer, and coordinate various community development, economic development, and planning projects for the city. One thing that I do that's one of my favorite parts of the work is managing our business retention and expansion program. So that is a way for the city to work directly with small and large businesses and corporations to kind of understand their company, how they're doing here in the city, and then also creating a connection for those companies to be able to reach out to the city if there's ever any assistance needed. Like I mentioned, that's one of the favorite parts of my work. And then also another thing to add to that is I also serve as a liaison for Ready Cincinnati, which is a regional economic development arm. So we encompass a lot of the different projects that come from the regional perspective, and we want to attract people to the city of Cincinnati. So we work with our regional arm to kind of understand some of those leads and some of those companies that are looking to come into the city. So then that leads to your question. So over the past couple of weeks, I've been negotiating a few development deals for some downtown buildings, possibly looking to renovate those into residential from office buildings, as we're seeing a decline in office due to COVID-19 and a number of different factors, but also repopulating the urban core, which is like one of my department's main initiatives, is bringing people back downtown, urban core, and making it more lively again. Because there was a time where people were moving up to the suburbs. So that left cities dead, decaying, vacant, underinvested. And we're seeing now, I think in probably the past 10 to 15 years, we're starting to see people influx back to the city, which has a lot of implications, positive and negative. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But to answer your question, it's mostly on the negotiation side. So majority of the time I'm negotiating deals. So that is where I underwrite, and that's looking at financial assumptions from a private developer and understanding the risks that the city might take if we go into a deal with that company or that organization. And then also making a wise recommendation to our city manager on if we should move forward with this company, particularly coming here or not. So that's mostly what this week has been consisted of, and it's honestly a whirlwind, but it's fun work. It's challenging, but it's very rewarding too.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely got to take some time to unpack all of that. And Bridget, I see your question. We got Bridget in the house. Bridget is a UC alumni, and just for anybody watching who doesn't know, I went to the University of Cincinnati, and I was actually, I think I graduated about 7 years before you did. And then I think I crossed the frat 10 years before you did. So this connection is definitely interesting, because the entire time you've been in Cincinnati, I've been away. I haven't been in Cincinnati, but every time I come back, we get an opportunity if we run into each other, man. So it's always good to chop it up with you. Now it's interesting to hear so I grew up in Cincinnati, and I remember what downtown Cincinnati was like, in the early and mid 2000s. I remember what Cincinnati was like after the race riots. I remember Cincinnati at 5 p.m. downtown Cincinnati became a ghost town. There was really no type of nightlife. There weren't any restaurants. It was really dead. Now, mind you, I was, a kid at the time, but I vividly remember downtown not really having a lot of life. And then over the course of, like you said, the last 10, 15 years, Cincinnati has made a dramatic shift. And if you're talking from a political standpoint, probably, and this is where it's interesting too, from my perspective, I think a lot of that started to change under Mayor Mallory. And that's where my connection to City Hall and the Economic Development Department actually starts, because in 2008, I actually interned in the mayor's office, partnered with the Department of Economic Development. And what we were doing at the time is we were trying to attract businesses for the Banks project, right? So what you're doing is similar, but it's, doing some different projects and things like that. But that's exciting, man. So to unpack some of the stuff you said, you talked about business attraction. You talked about working on regional projects or working with regional arms to attract business. You talked about business evaluation and project evaluation and basically doing some deal analysis. A lot of that stuff is, stuff that you do on a residential aspect, right? But we're talking at a much, much larger scale. So to contextualize that, what kind of dollar figures are we talking about in terms of commercial projects and things?
Yeah, so I mean, the number of the projects I've worked on have been 50 million plus projects. The biggest project I'm currently working on is just shy of 90 million. So I mean, the scale, it ranges
Yep.
depending on the project, the neighborhood that we're working in, and what the ultimate goal is. So we work on small commercial or residential projects, and then we also work on headquarter buildings and bringing large office and commercial tenants to downtown Cincinnati. So the spectrum and the range of projects is across the board.
Yep. Which partly touches on the role that cities play in the built environment, right? When we're talking about the built environment, we're talking about literally the buildings, right? The building, and you may have a more technical definition, because I came up through real estate more on the brokerage side, the development side. You came up more having more formal education, right? You're formally trained in urban planning. You're formally trained in sustainable development. So it's interesting. But in the built environment, cities have a responsibility for not only providing housing, and we have a question about affordable housing, but helping the city to move forward. And that's one of the roles that you play in trying to attract, helping to attract businesses to Cincinnati. But let's look at a question. We've got a question. Can you address the affordable housing drought in Cincinnati and how the city is working to address this? And then more specifically, how are they allowing one particular developer to take hold of the majority of real estate in OTR? And I'm curious, Bridget, if that question is referencing 3CDC by chance. And then if so, I'm sure Rob could give a better perspective on 3CDC's role and the type of entity that they actually are.
Yeah. Y'all gonna make me sound like a politician on this today.
Hey man, it's all
but yeah,
politics.
affordable housing. Yep, definitely. So as far as affordable housing, that's actually one of the topics I think about all day, every day, and how to make it work. I think to start off, the definition of affordable is different for a lot of different people. I think from a political standpoint, affordable, we look at the urban development and housing development, also known as HUD. We look at their numbers to kind of determine what is affordable. But to me personally, I think in the city, that number oftentimes is different than what is portrayed in the HUD numbers, just because they look at it from a metropolitan perspective, which encompasses suburbs. And so obviously you can see the difference between the city of Cincinnati and, say, for instance, a Mason or a neighborhood or a part of town like that. When you encompass those income levels, that makes that number increase a lot to where affordable to most people in the city of Cincinnati is not what it looks like for a regional perspective or a metropolitan perspective. So is by leveraging funding from the federal government while also working with state government, because honestly, local government doesn't have the amount of funds or the budget to be able to produce the amount of affordable housing that's needed here in the city. And we're oftentimes seeing that there's a lot more market rate development. While I do think that there's a need for a balance as far as income level and rents, I do think that affordable housing is definitely something that's dire needed here. And I always think of different ways and strategic relationships with different corporations, especially larger corporations, to be able to leverage those to be able to use some of that funding to make affordable housing work. I think we can use some case studies from other cities and bring some of those practices back to Cincinnati that I think could be advantageous for bringing more affordable housing.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, as you were mentioning that. So you mentioned the federal guidelines and comparing that to comparing the federal numbers to the local numbers, but how the federal HUD numbers basically are based on a regional perspective and not necessarily an urban core. Is that consistent across the board around the nation where they're giving more regional based numbers and not so much the urban core?
Yeah, I think so. Just
Yeah.
because the benchmark is typically when you're looking at those numbers is from HUD. So oftentimes they use that as the benchmark for what affordable means.
Yeah.
While affordable can mean a number of different things for different people. Because also I
Mhm.
think outside of housing, there's also other costs that are associated with life. So when you factor those in, affordable means a number of different things. So I think you
Yeah,
have to
absolutely.
factor those outside pieces into that too, into the housing number to make sure that what you think is affordable is actually affordable.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. Because definitely if you're only focused on the urban environment or breaking out the urban environment from the regional, those numbers may look totally different, especially depending on what section of the urban environment you're talking about. But affordable housing is a very challenging, very challenging issue, and I don't think any government around the country has it under control. I mean, from estimates I've seen, we are hundreds of thousands of units just in the region I'm in. I think the last time I saw a report, it was I think 250,000, somewhere between 200 to 300,000 in terms of the need for affordable housing. And city governments just aren't built, even if it's just from a bureaucracy standpoint and being able to get projects and permits and funding and all of the type of stuff that goes into affordable housing. There's just no way to catch up with that need. It would take decades, but that's interesting. So a second part to that question, Bridget. So Bridget actually works for DC government. She works for Department of Housing and Community Development as well. And she was just asking about 3CDC. And from what little bit I know, 3CDC is kind of a quasi government agency, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So it's not it's not just straight private development. I think it's designed to help spur private development, and I believe in partnership as well as solely they do some developing. But I
Yep.
think they're equipped to be able to develop the properties that financially may not make sense for a private developer, right? Because especially in Cincinnati, you're talking about very large buildings that are extremely dilapidated, and from a number standpoint between the downtown, those particular areas of downtown and where the market may be in terms of demand, as well as the rates for the rentals, as well as the cost of rehabbing those buildings, it makes it a lot more challenging for strictly a private developer to come in. So there has to be some type of organization that can kind of absorb those costs and or help provide favorable financing that would make that project less risky to a private developer, because as an investment, that's as risky of an investment as a developer can take on.
Yeah, I think you
Yeah.
brought up some great points. And to add a little bit more context about 3CDC, so their main goal was to repopulate and revitalize the urban core. This was in response to the 2001 riots. So they were formulated by a number of different large corporations here in the city. So they have that financial backing to then be able to purchase buildings and then create developments. So they've been around for a little while now. And I think honestly, the work that they do is good and their end product. But I do think that there are some ways that the community engagement could be improved. I think that there's a lot of ways that they could work with the community more to include a lot of the needs that they have from the current residents, and also understanding that new residents will come in. So I think from a political perspective, I think 3CDC is hitting the nail on the head as far as revitalizing our urban core. On the social side, I think that there's some ways that they could improve. And ultimately, I want to create my own real estate development firm that is mission driven, that does a lot of the things that I see not happening in the field from the work that I'm doing now. But I ultimately want to have my own firm that is doing it the right way, that's working with communities, with the people, and understanding challenges and needs. and then creating developments that are everlasting and sustainable in neighborhoods that everybody can be proud of.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a challenge. That's a challenge. And I commend you for definitely wanting to take it on. I think having the inside experience and insight that you have definitely go a long way in helping you, achieve and accomplish that mission. Typically, you have the same issues in DC. Let me see. Bridget just came. Could the city place restrictions on these developments, income restrictions on some units, employment from residents in the neighborhoods? Yeah, absolutely. So I'll definitely let Rob touch on that. I think so. Rob, if you could talk a little bit more too about the financial analysis and the underwriting piece, because a lot of times on the outside, it's like, okay, you know, why aren't they doing this or why aren't they doing that, in terms of especially like restricting the units or restricting a certain number of units. There has the financial analysis piece has to, right, it has to pin out. And if it doesn't pin out for the investor or the developer and the profit goals that they have, as well as not just the profit goals, but the financing, the carrying costs, all the expenses that go into carrying a deal, it's not always so black and white, as in, well, why can't 50% of the units be restricted or 75% of the units be restricted? Can you talk a little bit about the restrictions on the developments, particularly on some of the units, as well as including residents from the neighborhoods who can be employed to work on these projects?
Yeah, so I mean, when you think about development, at the end of the day, it all comes down to the numbers. I think understanding perspective on, you want to revitalize, you want to make neighborhoods better, but then you also have to understand that as a developer, that person is taking a risk because they're putting up a lot of upfront costs to purchase the building, to develop the building, to do the construction on the building, to bring it to life. So then there has to be some type of return, which I think I ultimately understand. I do think that there's ways that developers can leverage funding more. And I think that's by working with city development departments to kind of understand some of the tax incentives and tools that cities have. There's also a lot of funding out there that's just sitting too, that I think developers could apply for. Obviously, it takes a little bit more work on their side, but I think if you're a mission-driven developer, I think it's worth that amount of time and effort that you have to put into it. To answer the question about restricting incomes, sometimes it just doesn't work financially to be able to include restrictive housing. But I do think that there's a need for that. I think that so typically a lot of the restricted housing comes from CMHA, which is Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority. And I'm pretty sure a lot of other cities across the nation have these housing authorities as well. And their main focus is to create housing, whether it's through vouchers or restrictive covenants on rents, to then lock those rents in so that people can have affordable housing and they're not pushed out of their neighborhood, regardless of what kind of happens around them. So we don't particularly work on restrictive housing at the city. That's more so something that we administer and work through with our housing authorities. But the city does have influence as the city creates policies that then those types of organizations and authorities implement.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay. And let's see, Bridget, she said, yep, tax incentives, housing production trust fund to provide some funding in the deal to offset the costs. Yep. So I don't know how the housing authority has everything set up in Cincinnati, but what she's referencing is, so DC has a housing production trust fund, and I believe right now they're putting like $100 million a year into the trust fund to help spur development and offset, some of the affordable housing costs. So I'm assuming that the housing authority in Cincinnati may have some type of trust or some type of vehicle that they're using to help finance the affordable housing, and those funds coming directly from city council and city council's budget.
Yep, that's correct. So the city does have an affordable housing trust fund. It's fairly newer, and right now we're currently trying to beef up those the numbers and get more money into that affordable housing trust fund. to then start administering it to developers and dishing that money out so that we can get these affordable housing units on the line. I will say, like I said, it's only been a few years since the Affordable Housing Trust Fund has honestly been active. So still trying to find funding sources. Earlier this year, there was a ballot up for potentially the city having to create or provide $50 million a year from the city budget, which I think would have been detrimental to the city budget. Anybody who can see a city budget, you'll understand that most cities don't have $50 million that they can allocate every year solely for affordable housing, while we do understand that there's a need for that. So I think understanding you have to work with large corporations, banks, state, federal governments, and leveraging those funds to then create more affordable housing, I think is the ultimate goal. You have to work together. It's a melting pot of all different people, or it's not solely on the city. I think there's just an ecosystem of people that have to come together and create a plan that actually is intentional about creating affordable housing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you touched on the city budget, and I'm glad you touched on there has to specifically be mission-driven developers, because so from a financial standpoint, as you mentioned, like that money is coming from the city council's budget. So for one, if there isn't enough money being allocated to affordable housing, then that's a issue that the people of the city have to come together and lobby like everybody else, right? Like, you hate to say it, but this is also a lesson on politics, right? Every group of people, if they have any type of issue and they want any type of change that's going to require any type of legislation or any type of written pen from city council or from the mayor and the city manager, from anybody, they have to lobby, right? There's no way around it. You have to lobby for the things that you want. So there's the conversation there of a stronger lobbying presence, but even trumping the strong lobbying presence is whether or not the city has the money. And especially, and when you're talking about times like right now, where you have, say, a pandemic that impacts a city's budget, impacts, a government's budget, because there may be lower, tax revenues from retail transactions and things like that, that's going to impact the city's budget as well. So they have to be able to run the entire city, allocate funds to all the different line items that they have to allocate to. And all, like you said, although affordable housing is an issue, there are a lot of other issues that the city has to address at the same time. So it's definitely a challenge. And then from an affordable housing development standpoint, the majority of developers, the majority of investors are private citizens, they're private companies, they're for-profit companies. And when you have mission-driven organizations, you may have, like, I can think of, maybe five or six or seven in DC off the top of my head, but you're talking about 5 or 6 or 7 organizations versus thousands of private investors and private developers who are for profit. So the challenge there is truncated just by the sheer numbers. There aren't enough mission-driven organizations. So the more people who are concerned about affordable housing and want to see change, one of the routes is creating these mission-driven organizations, because the vast majority of people who are in real estate and in real estate investing, they're I don't want to say they're in it for the money, but as we mentioned earlier, the numbers have to make sense. And because of the financing sources, because of the private capital sources, people want a return on their money, right? There has to be a return on their money all the way down the capital stack. So to get around that, you need more people, like Rob said, who are interested in creating these mission-driven organizations who can then go out and help, help build the affordable housing. But I think there's also, when we have these conversations about affordable housing, there's also the conversation, and I'll just throw this out there. We don't have to, dig too deep into it, but I always find it interesting that we don't talk enough about how can we help elevate the people who are who may be struggling with being able to afford housing, because on one side of the coin, we cannot you cannot stop the flow of progress and the increase in the cost of living. So how can we help, people continue to increase their yearly income to help them offset the cost or the increase in the cost of living? And right now is a prime example of that, because inflation is running rampant, and there's nothing you can do about inflation, right?
Yep.
Well, I won't say nothing, but it is what it is. So, all right, let's see. So we'll come back to that. I don't want the entire convo to be about affordable housing. So let's switch it up a little bit. So you have a degree in urban planning, a bachelor's degree in urban planning. Can you tell us a little bit about what is urban planning, and then what made you become interested in urban planning?
Okay. So to set the stage, I had no idea what this was prior to 2011.
Okay.
So I'll give like the technical term just because I went to school for it. So urban planning is a technical and like a political process that's focused on development and the design of land uses in a built environment, which includes air, water, infrastructure, urban areas such as transportation, communication, all the networks that kind of make cities function. And why that's important is because it answers questions about how people live, work, play in a given area, and then that guides orderly development within urban and rural areas, which positively and negatively affects all of us. So I think it's important for everybody to base level know what urban planning is and how it impacts us.
Yep. And that's a great response. And one way, probably one of the easiest ways that people can get involved or at least be cognizant of what's happening in the urban environment is paying attention to the zoning, right? Because the zoning is constantly changing, or there's constant questions around zoning. And the zoning is what determines the land use for a particular area. So you may live in a residential area, and somebody big may be pushing to change some of the zoning in that area so they can build, whatever commercial building or industrial building. And let's say you live in a residential area and an industrial building is going to be built, now you have maybe pollution issues or traffic issues or something like that, right? So definitely paying attention to zoning and your zoning department, and maybe even just hopping on the city's email list, right? A lot of times cities have very extensive communication channels that you can simply sign up and receive an email on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis that gives you, some of the updates. But keeping with that line of communication, what are some ways that people can get more involved or stay up to date with different things happening, coming out of the community and economic development department?
Yeah, so oftentimes any incentive that we do and most of the work that we do hits the city council floor, which is public meetings that's open to anybody to attend either in person or virtual. So I definitely encourage people. I know the meeting times are not ideal because it's mostly during the workday where other people have other jobs and things to do. But I do encourage people to stay in tune with their local city councils because a lot of decisions are made on that floor that a lot of us don't pay attention to. And honestly, I didn't pay much attention to before working in this city government space. So I encourage everybody to kind of stay in tune with what's going on with your local city councils, and then making sure that you're in the know when deals are being made, because oftentimes they provide opportunities for the public to come and speak and on these topics, and we just aren't there that much, to be honest. So I think you just have to be civically engaged and be open to kind of understanding what's going on at the city level, because I think it has a lot of impact on our cities and kind of the things that we see that we like and don't like in our cities.
Yeah, absolutely. Which takes us back to one, just the initial conversation of having this platform and helping educate people on literally the role, that city and city government plays in impacting and affecting their life. Which takes us to the second half of the question we had earlier. You said, I didn't really know what urban planning was until, 2011. So how did you find out about urban planning? Was it just, you try to figure out what you're going to major in, or, how did that come about?
Yeah, so when I first got to college, as a first generation college student, I had no clear path of what I wanted my career to be. Really didn't know much about too many careers outside of the general ones that most people know. Always excelled in school, always had good grades, and school was always a priority of mine. So I knew I wanted to go to college. So like most people, when you go into college, I thought I wanted to be a doctor or go in the medical field. Stepped a foot into my first chemistry class at UC and knew that it was not for me. I knew it wasn't something that I would enjoy waking up doing every day. It's something that I saw myself doing long term. So I quickly got out of that major. And then I started going through the exploratory path where I worked with my college advisor to kind of understand what my characteristics were, personality traits, and how that could translate into a career. So I did a number of tests with my college advisor to kind of understand what those career paths look like. And urban planning actually was at the top of that list. So like I mentioned, I had no idea what it was. So I took an intro class, and I got really embedded in like the understanding of how history of cities and how cities are the way that they are and why they are the way that they are. So then that got me just really invested into this field. And I applied for the program through the Design, Architecture, Art, and Planning program at UC, and it was accepted. And in my time at UC, I was able to do 4 different co-ops. So I got a really good experience of what urban planning and development looked like in the real world. And I was very strategic about the co-ops that I did too. I made sure that I went into a public sector, community development work, the private sector, and then also a real estate company too. I wanted to get that full spectrum to kind of understand what the field had to offer and where I saw myself being a part of that puzzle. So my UC program was solid, but I didn't really understand the financial piece of development. And that's the real part of development to me, because without the money, the project doesn't work. So to be able to understand the money was something that I still was craving to learn more about. So then I kind of guided my decision to go into my sustainable real estate development program at Tulane. One, for anybody that knows me, New Orleans is one of my favorite cities. So I knew I wanted to be there at some point in life. And then this grad program that I found at Tulane was just a perfect match. So then I went there for 1 year. It was a very fast-paced year, but I think it was honestly one of the best years of my life. I think I grew a lot professionally, socially, and I just grew overall. Being in a place where I knew no one, far away from home, so I wasn't able to just drive up 71 back home to Columbus like I normally would. But it made me more of a well-rounded person. So that's kind of how I got into this urban planning field, which is non-traditional, but I'm glad I went down the path that I did.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And you said a couple things that I think are important. You talked about, getting to college and not really having a lot of exposure to what people, what people do for a living, basically what career options are out there. And it's so funny because I was literally just telling a group of people this earlier this week. Like, I went to school for accounting, and the only reason why I went to school for accounting at UC is because I took an accounting course in high school, and I was like, all right, I kind of like this. But I didn't really have a lot of exposure to what people do for a living. So when I got to college, that was the easiest thing to choose because it was something that I could easily identify with. But over time, as I was going through school and I realized, okay, I don't want to be an accountant. Some of those key pieces that helped me figure out my direction were the personality assessments, right? Going through those personality assessments and really figuring out who you are, what type of environment you are best suited to work in, what type of work you might or you think you will wake up and enjoy doing on a daily basis. So for anybody watching, if you have a child or you have a teen or you have somebody that's coming up and they haven't made that decision in terms of deciding what they want to do, post high school, helping them go through some of these things can definitely help shave some years off of their just their learning curve in terms of helping them figure out who they are and what type of impact they want to make on the world and how they're going to do it. So I think those are very, very, very important pieces. And from what we can tell, everything worked out for you, man. That was a good decision and a good path. And now you are, making that step up the ladder to ultimately accomplish some of your other big goals. But that's exciting, man. That's exciting. So what does in terms of urban planning, and you talked about how cities are made, right? And there's probably some concepts in there about redlining and things like that. What are some interesting things that you may have learned about how cities were designed when it comes to even equity, equitable treatment? Um, just what are some of your thoughts on how cities were designed and how that impacted or impacts people?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up redlining because that was actually, once I got hip to what redlining even was, that was something that I always wanted to learn more about. So I did some fact finding and found there's actually redlining maps that are out there that oftentimes are hard to find for various reasons. But
Right.
I've been able to find redlining maps of Columbus and Cincinnati actually. And it's
Really
very interesting to kind of understand where and what neighborhoods
interesting.
redlining was implemented and where it took place, because you can
Interesting.
see that now,
You can
years
still see
later,
it.
why
Uh,
those neighborhoods are the way that they are. So just kind of
yep.
understanding, and to give a little bit of context about redlining, I'm not sure of the time, but back in the day,
We're
there was a
good.
time where banks would not lend to certain people, mostly African Americans and minorities, for the reason because they didn't want people to be in their certain neighborhood. So they would draw maps literally in a red line around an area that they would not serve, they wouldn't lend, and that basically kept those neighborhoods at a standstill for a very long time. And you can still see that today with a lot of neighborhoods in Columbus and Cincinnati. Why some neighborhoods are behind and some neighborhoods are thriving. A lot of that goes back to the history of cities and redlining and some of those other negative things that have been put into policy that implemented and ultimately made our cities the way that they are. So a lot of the work now is undoing that and doing right, I think. But also you have to understand that urban context and that history context to be able to make informed decisions for the future of what our cities and neighborhoods look like.
Mm. Yeah, that's I never thought to look at the redlining map and compare it to the existing environment today, right? That's a powerful perspective, and I can already guess in my head a couple neighborhoods that probably were redlined and some that were protected, because Cincinnati neighborhoods haven't quite changed that much. They
Yep.
haven't, they haven't. So that's interesting, man. That's interesting. So it's 7:48. We still got a couple minutes. I did want to ask you. So we may have a lot of investors watching or will watch over the next 24 hours. Obviously, I promote to a lot of real estate investors. So what are some ways or what are some things that private investors can do to work better with the city or to grow in terms of maybe growing from residential to commercial, to work with the city or to get funding from the city? What are some things that smaller investors can do to kind of elevate their game and start to play in a bigger, in a bigger arena?
Yeah, so working for the city of Cincinnati, there's a lot of different departments. So we work directly with our Department of Economic Inclusion, who does a lot of our small business goals and works with local and small business and minority contractors to bring them on the line and then to create opportunity for some of those smaller players in the game to get bids on bigger projects. So I would encourage people to reach out to, specifically in Cincinnati, Department of Economic Inclusion, and my department, Community and Economic Development, to kind of understand some of the opportunities that are out there. There's distribution lists that you can be added on for projects. So one thing that the city does is we have aspirational goals for any project that we incentivize that the project has at least 30% small business, minority business inclusion. And those are some inclusion goals that have been set from city council members. And it's a policy now that we've been implementing. So it's a way for, like I said, those small players in the game to get big bids so that they can grow their businesses. Because oftentimes those opportunities are just present it to the larger corporations, and that's how those bigger corporations continue to thrive, and the smaller ones kind of fall from the wayside. So I think working with your local departments of economic inclusion and development and understanding some of the opportunities that are there would better guide you. And I think it would help a lot of investors get a lot of benefit from the city to do development here in the city. I also think that there's a lot of financial assistance. I kind of alluded to tax abatements. The city also has sometimes direct cash for projects, not too often just because of budget constraints, but depending on the scale and what the project and the ultimate goal of the project, there is direct cash that has been allocated for projects. Also, my department particularly has a small business function where we have small business funding and loan programs that are a little bit better than a bank, because most times with smaller developers and investors, it's harder to get finance from a bank just because of the risk that's assumed and a lot of other factors. So working with a city department, or we have connections to other organizations such as the Cincinnati Development Fund, which serves as it's a smaller bank. It's a community development bank pretty much, and it encourages small developers and investors to get into the development space, and they can be creative with their financing because they don't have as many constraints as a larger bank such as Chase or US Bank. So I also encourage people to get acclimated with some community development financing organizations within your city, because they have funding too that they can provide for some of those smaller projects.
Beautiful, beautiful. So what I hear you say is, one, you got to raise your hand, right?
Yeah.
You got to raise your hand. You got to pick up the phone. You got to make some phone calls. You got to show up to some meetings. You got to really just get tapped in and find out what's going on in the city. And then on the flip side, what I hear you say is there is a ton of opportunity, a ton of resources, a ton of financial tools, a ton of legal tools to help any smaller developer who wants to make that switch or that growth or add on to their own tool belt by getting into bigger projects and getting into some of those more those bigger circles. So from a mindset standpoint, we'll finish with this. From a mindset standpoint, it may be challenging for a smaller investor to take on the bigger task, the bigger challenge of interacting with government, interacting with all these different agencies, because that adds layers onto layers in terms of skill set, right? But then layers in terms of decision makers, layers in terms of people that they have to interact with and talk with, just a lot of additional layers that may include, and it may not, but it also may include additional time frames. So from a mindset standpoint, and you being a brother who, you're a very high level thinker, right? Very high level operator. You understand, this space from a very high level. From a mindset standpoint, any insight on helping a smaller investor, a smaller developer kind of see themselves in a bigger light and see themselves being able to take advantage of these bigger opportunities that exist in their local government?
Yeah, so I think, like you mentioned at the beginning, I think just honestly picking up the phone and reaching out to your economic development departments to build a connection, I think that oftentimes goes a long way. I think at my work, I've been able to create a lot of relationships with small developers just because I have an open personality. I think I'm open to understanding how people are and where people come from. And I think that perspective makes people feel more comfortable when you are working with them to kind of create some of those challenges and eliminate a lot of the barriers that are in the way. I think just simply creating those connections. I'm also just staying civically engaged. I think if you show face and you're present and you put your best foot forward every time, I think a lot of things will happen. Obviously, it's a lot more challenging for smaller developers, but I mean, everybody has to start from somewhere. So I think just putting yourself out there the best way you can and advocating for yourself and your product is the best way to get involved. But I definitely would encourage people to get more involved with their local governments. While for the longest, I was never involved with my government or anything civically really engaged besides voting like everybody does. But I definitely encourage people to get more civically engaged. It has a lot of impact on our lives and the things that we do and don't do and what we want to see in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. And just in terms of ideas on how to get more civically engaged, especially if you're, in the real estate space, you have local realtor associations, you have local builder associations. I'm not sure if they have a branch or a similar organization in Cincinnati, but you out here in DC, you have the DCBIA, the Builder Industry Association, but you have industry organizations that one of their primary responsibilities is advocating on behalf of their members, and that may include advocating on behalf of the city or the residents, depending on what the organization is. So there are a lot of organizations that have political arms so that they can advocate and lobby on behalf of their constituents. And then also starting at the community level, whether it be the local community meeting, the neighborhood meeting. I'm not sure how Cincinnati is set up in terms of the local community organizations, but a lot of times, depending on where you are, in every community, there's a group of elected people, right, who are responsible for representing that community and interacting with city council. That's a great way to get involved. Attend those meetings, because if there's anything happening in that community, oftentimes the government official or the developer is going to, or they should come to that meeting, pitch their business plan or pitch their project. Or if you want to, run for office at that city, at that community level. And that could even be a pipeline to, one day becoming a mayor, becoming a governor. I've seen a lot of people come up through the community organizations and get elected to city council, and then run from city council and run for mayor. So there are a lot of different ways for you to get politically involved, but that absolutely is critical if you want to have a say in what's happening in your city, what's happening in your state. So I definitely couldn't have said it better. But thanks, Rob. I appreciate you for hopping on tonight. I think this was a great conversation. And as we have talked offline, we definitely got a lot of good stuff coming up. And I think it's important that anybody who is in a position of influence, who's in a privileged position, to see how things are going, right? Like Rob is at the table every single day. If you are at the table, take some time to share that knowledge and that information with other people so that we can raise the conscious level, we can raise the level of awareness, and that might give somebody else a little bit of information, just a bit of information that they need to find some direction in their life, to find some purpose in their life. So again, Rob, I thank you for getting on and giving us, an hour of your time, and looking forward to collaborating with you again in the future, brother.
For sure. I appreciate everybody for coming out tonight. I think this was an insightful conversation, and I love having this conversation, especially with our people, and sharing this knowledge. So if anybody wants to reach out, feel free to get my contact information from Kev. Like I said, I love talking about this stuff. I'm tired now, though.
That brother been working. Absolutely. So you can definitely reach out to Rob directly through Facebook or LinkedIn. If for some reason you're scared to reach out to him, just hit me up and I'll make the connection. But thanks again, Rob. Have a great night, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Appreciate it.